terrified of right now. The wandering, the hurt.
Good morning, everyone. That was kind of half-hearted. Morning, everyone. Oh, that's much better. Good Friday morning to you. Welcome to our seminar with Dr. Calvin Beisner on climate change, global warming, and the use of fossil fuels. I think it's going to be a really informative moment for us. We are so glad that he was able to come and be with us. I'm going to have Wayne Grudem, one of our elders, professor at Phoenix Seminary, introduce him in just a minute. But just a couple of words of encouragement. Number one, feel free if you need to get up and get a cup of coffee or a cup of water. Just don't spill. Please. No, I'm just kidding. But help yourself to that. And we want to encourage Dr. Beisner as he's traveling through the country right now. And so there's an envelope on the table with all the books. By the way, all those books are free for you. But there's an envelope on that table, a golden envelope. And we want to just encourage you to help us provide him with a generous love offering. So if you're going to write a check, write the check to the Cornwall Alliance, C-O-R-N, like corn, what you chew, and wall. So Cornwall Alliance. And then you can just slip it in there. And we will be extremely grateful, and I'm sure the Cornwall Alliance will be as well. So thank you for coming this morning. Dr. Grudem, come on up, Wayne. And he will introduce our speaker this morning. Oh, you're going to do something else, too.
Well, we talked about it.
That's right.
I've been teaching theology for 45 years, and every class begins with a hymn. So, could we stand and sing, "This is my Father's World"? I think it'll go up on the screen. This is my Father's world, and to my listening ears, all nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. A little bit faster. This is my Father's world, I rest in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, and the wonders wrought. This is my Father's world, the birds their carols raise, the morning light, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's world, He shines in all that's fair. In the rustling grass I hear Him pass, He speaks to me everywhere. This is my Father's world, from shining courts above, the beloved one, His only Son, was given to show God's love. This is my Father's world, why should my heart be sad? The Lord is King, let the heavens ring, God reigns, let earth be glad. This is my Father's world, oh let me ne'er forget, that though the wrong seems all so strong, God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's world, the battle is not done. Jesus who died shall be satisfied, and earth and heaven be one. Let's pray. Our Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for Cal Beisner and his study of your word and his study of your earth. We thank you for the opportunity to think about these things, and we seek that you would give us wisdom and help us to honor you in what we think and how we approach this question. Pray that you'd be with the question and answer session too, and make the time worthwhile and well spent. Help Cal to speak clearly, effectively, and bring wisdom from you. In Jesus' name, amen. I met Cal Beisner 34 years ago at a seminar with about 10 other faculty members from different colleges and seminaries at Baylor University. And everybody else at the 10-person seminar, as we talked over the course of a week, everybody was impressed with this young man, Cal Beisner, who seemed to know so much about the Bible and economics and apologetics. Well, anyway, Cal Beisner grew up with a father who worked for the State Department, and when he was 1 year old, they moved to India, and he still has memories from childhood of living in India for a year, or just a little over a year, until he was 2. He received a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies in religion and philosophy from the University of Southern California, and a PhD in Scottish history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He taught interdisciplinary studies at Covenant College in Tennessee and historical theology and social ethics at Knox Theological Seminary in Florida. He's a fellow of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. He's an adjunct fellow of the Acton Institute. He's an elder, has been an elder at both the Presbyterian Church in America, that's the conservative Presbyterian Church, the Bible-believing one, and the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And we allowed him in a Bible church today. Heritage Foundation gave him an award as an outstanding spokesperson for faith, science, and stewardship at the Heartland Institute, Ninth International Conference on Climate Change. He's spoken on several continents. He's been an expert witness on ethics and economics of climate change at the U.S. Senate, the Committee of the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's briefed the White House Council on Environmental Policy. And just to complete his ecumenical credentials, he's not only spoken at a Bible church today, he was at the Vatican speaking to a scholarly colloquium on climate change at the Pontifical Institute for Justice and Peace. He's a frequent guest speaker on Christian and secular radio talk shows. And my friend, welcome, Calvin Beisner.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you so much, brother.
I forgot to say something that wasn't written down. I think he knows more than any human being about the interrelationship between the Christian faith and global warming.
Thank you, Wayne.
Oh, you got it.
I think I'm on, right? Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming this morning. It's kind of an unusual time to do something like this, but I really appreciate your turning out. And I hope that I can leave you with some helpful thoughts this morning. I want to, before I jump into the presentation itself, I'd like to just familiarize you a little bit with the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We are a think tank, really, and my wife coined the briefest, best way, I think, to describe what we do. We're trying to save the planet from the people who are trying to save the planet. All right? Okay, here's the deal. We are a network of just under 70 scholars. About a third of them are natural scientists, physicists, chemists, atmospheric scientists, meteorologists, climatologists, environmental scientists, biologists, and so on. And among our scholars are some of the world's top climate scientists. So when we speak to that issue, we are not doing so out of any ignorance of climate science. About a third of us are economists, specializing either in environmental economics or in developmental economics. How can we bring the principles of economics, the insights of economics, to bear on how to address the concerns about environmental stewardship and especially about how whole societies rise and stay out of poverty. I'll have a little bit more to say about that shortly. And then another third of us are theologians, philosophers, ethicists, pastors, ministry leaders, and so on. And we try to bring together the insights of all of those different disciplines to have a truly interdisciplinary look at very, very complex problems. How complex? Well, you might approach it this way. The word environment comes from the French word environ, which means surroundings. And in all my life, I haven't been able to figure anything that's not our surroundings. I mean, that's the hair on the back of my head to Alpha Centauri is all part of our surroundings. So environmentalism might be called everythingism. And that's kind of related to another term in the English language, totalitarianism. And that's why so much of the environmental movement tends to lean very heavily toward very, very intense government regulation of pretty much every sphere of life. We're not opposed to all regulation. Some is very good. God made us to be law users and law abiders, but law can go too far. And when that happens, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. We have a mission to educate the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, all tied together. And I'll give you a bit more about biblical earth stewardship and economic development later on. With the gospel, our aim is to reconcile people to God. Sinners like me can be reconciled to the holy God by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And when we are reconciled to God, we begin to learn to understand His world as He designed it and to know how to use it properly. We are supposed, as the church, to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all things I have commanded you, Jesus said. No, I left out a couple of words there. Teaching them to obey all things I have commanded you. And as people are reconciled to God and taught to obey all things that He has commanded them, some of those things have to do with how we steward this earth, how we take care of the natural world around us as a matter of loving God and loving neighbor. Let's see, jump here in terms of this little introduction. We do have a literature table out front there. As Steve mentioned, the literature is free. We do have little tags there suggesting donations for it, but you are welcome to take things totally free as well. I want to mention just a few things on there. Climate Change and the Christian is a DVD of a lecture that I've given that is much more detailed than what you'll get this morning. It's much, much longer, as a matter of fact. But that is one thing that you can use that's highly educational. Blue is another DVD, Blue. Well, that stands for Beautify, Liberate, Utilize, Enjoy. And it's an alternative to green, right? So the green movement tells us to keep hands off of so many things. The author of this documentary, Blue, which is just marvelously well made, is saying, look, for Earth, for humanity, for freedom, we need a different approach to environmental stewardship. There's a book out there called Global Warming Skepticism for Busy People. It's by one of my board members. He's a senior fellow. He is Dr. Roy W. Spencer. He's a NASA award-winning climate scientist, a principal research scientist at the University of Alabama in climatology and particularly long-term climate change. He and his partner, John Christie, both of them wonderful Christians, manage NASA's Satellite Global Temperature Monitoring System, which is the best we have in the world. And by the way, according to that, the world has warmed a whole lot less than what the climate alarmists claim. We also have one out there called How Does the Creation Care Movement Threaten the Pro-Life Movement? And this is a real burden on my heart. Much of the creation care movement, that's the term that the adherents of this, many Christian environmentalists claim to be into creation care. Much of that actually undermines the pro-life movement. I don't have time to explain to you now how and why, but if you pick that booklet up, you'll find out. And then there's also a book there called Creation Stewardship, Evaluating Competing Views. And this issue that I'm talking to you about today is actually very controversial in evangelical Christian circles. And that booklet interacts in great detail with those who have different views from those represented by the Cornwall Alliance. And one other thing that's on a very different topic, but a really hot topic for today, is a book called Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. And that is directly confronting much of the woke, progressive, social justice movement of our day, and I hope that you will pick up a copy of that. You can learn more about us in a variety of different ways. You can subscribe to our emails. If you have your phone on you, I'm not asking you to turn it off. I'm asking you to pull it out and go to cornwallalliance.org. Scroll down to the bottom of the home page, and you can sign up for our email newsletters. They're always educational. We also have a podcast called Created to Reign. Created to Reign, that's R-E-I-G-N. And there's a card on our table out there that will help you to find out how to get to that. But any Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms have Created to Reign from the Cornwall Alliance. And you can also follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. And Wayne asked me particularly to mention a forthcoming book that we have that is going to be published next summer by Regnery Publishing. And the working title at this point is Climate and Energy Policy: The Case for Realism. Wayne actually suggested this book to me about a year and a half ago, something like that. And the aim here is to provide impeccable scholarship in support of a realistic, fairly skeptical approach to understanding human-induced climate change and how our policies ought to respond to that, especially related to energy. And I want to just give you a quick rundown of some of the chapters in that. We have one on the history and politics of climate change by Dr. David Legates, who is our Director of Research and Education, recently retired from a long career teaching climatology at the University of Delaware. We have one on the science of climate by Dr. Roy Spencer, whom I mentioned a moment ago. One on climate models and scientific method, testing the basis for fears. You hear all the time about computer climate models. Well, they are ridiculously unreliable when actually tested against real-world observations, and this chapter will explain why. There's one on the role of the sun by Dr. Willie Soon, an astrophysicist at the Solar, Stellar, and Planetary Sciences Division of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. One on the role of the oceans by Dr. Anthony Lupo, who is a professor of atmospheric science at the University of Missouri, and on and on. I could go into more detail, but I really think I should get on to the actual topic for today, or we'll run out of time. That book, I think, should be something that will end the debate, at least among evangelical Christians, because all of the authors contributing to it embrace the biblical worldview, biblical ethics, and yet they are outstanding scientists, economists, energy specialists, and the aim is to help the evangelical world to understand this really well. All right, now, I have mentioned to you that there are controversies about all of this. That should not be a great surprise, right, that there are any controversies about environmentalism. I tend to think that it's helpful to see things in terms of two basic competing worldviews. One worldview recognizes that the world was designed by an infinitely wise and was created by an infinitely powerful and is sustained by an infinitely faithful Creator God. And from that flow certain implications about how we understand the world. But the competing worldview denies that creator-creature distinction. And of course, Paul warns us in Romans 1, what happens when you do that? You begin to worship and serve the creature instead of the creator. God gives you over to a reprobate mind, professing yourself to be wise. You become a fool, and you pursue all kinds of grossly immoral things, but also just plain stupid things. And that, I think, lies behind much of the environmental movement. Most of the environmental movement around us is either atheistic, secularist, materialist, or pantheistic. In atheism, there is no God. The universe is the ultimate reality, which of course means the universe is God, right? And in pantheism, God is the universe, right? And there are subdivisions of that. Panentheism, where God is to the universe as the soul is to the body, or spiritism or animism, where there are lots of little gods and they inhabit rocks and trees and rivers and so on. But in either case, you don't distinguish the creator from the creature. And that leads you into the follies of so much of the environmental movement. The biblical worldview, of course, maintains that creator-creature distinction. And if you embrace that first one, the secularist or pantheist worldview, you basically see the universe as having come about, and the world itself and all life in the world, having come about by blind chance over time. And as a result, you tend to think of the natural world as very fragile, delicate, right? And yet, strangely enough, most of the people in this also think of it as a very nurturing place. And so for much of the environmental movement, the policy implication is that human beings need to learn to just get along with nature, live in harmony with nature, minimize your carbon footprint, minimize your impact on the environment. And if we would do that, everything would be peachy keen. The problem is that their vision of what it means to live in harmony with nature means that about the most we do in terms of production is subsistence agriculture. Pretty much every person involved in raising his or her own food. Well, we know what that brings historically. It brings life that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes put it. The average life expectancy prior to the Industrial Revolution all over the world was between 27 and 28 years. Infant and child mortality rate, the rate at which people die before their 5th birthday, was roughly 50%. It's only since the Industrial Revolution, since we went way beyond subsistence agriculture, in which more than 90% of all human beings were farming, into an industrial culture, that we've seen this change, that we've seen life expectancy rise from around 27 or 28 years to worldwide average now of almost 70, and in highly developed countries of about 80 at this point, and it's still rising in terms of long terms. This is really important, that we recognize that we don't want to minimize our impact on the natural world. Instead, we don't want to maximize it either. Instead, we want to optimize it. Our biblical worldview, with the creator-creature distinction, tells us that instead of being fragile, delicate, right, the earth is actually very robust, resilient, and self-correcting. You don't get massive damage from minor perturbations. And in fact, when Mount St. Helens explodes with far more power than thousands of atomic bombs, and it destroys forest all around it, within a fairly short time, all of that has grown back. The earth is amazingly resilient. This doesn't mean we should be careless toward it, but it does mean that we should be very skeptical of claims of existential threat in terms of environmental problems. Now, at the same time that as believers, we think of the world as robust, resilient, self-correcting, we also recognize, though, that because of sin and God's judgment on sin, putting a curse on the earth is not naturally all that nourishing. Instead, we get barely enough to survive unless we really make big changes in the earth around us. And we have a biblical mandate to do exactly that. In Genesis 1:28, having created Adam and Eve after his own image, male and female, God blessed them, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth." That's everything about the earth. Human beings are supposed to subdue and rule. Fill, subdue, rule. This means that our impact on the world should be optimal. Well, what does that look like? Well, let's start with the fact that we're made in God's image. What do we know at that point, if we have just started reading the Bible for the first time, about God? Well, let's see. He brought everything out of nothing. That's pretty productive. He brought light out of darkness. Light in Scripture consistently symbolizes truth, knowledge, understanding. He brought order out of chaos. He brought life out of non-life. He brought great variety and abundance of life, and he told every form of life to be fruitful and multiply and fill its niche in the earth. So our dominion over the earth should reflect that. At the Cornwall Alliance, we have adopted a brief way of saying that. Godly dominion, based on Genesis 1:28, means men and women created in God's image, laboring lovingly together to enhance the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. So that we're really addressing those two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. That's the dominion mandate for us. And under that, instead of seeing the earth as delicate and nurturing, we see it as robust but a dangerous place. Believe me, you don't want to be dropped into the Amazon rainforest naked with no friends and no tools. You will not last for more than a day or two. The earth is a dangerous place until we subdue it. We need to master it. Well, unfortunately, the climate alarmist part of the environmental movement sees things very differently and sees climate change driven by human activity as an extremely dangerous thing, even as an existential threat. So, how is human-induced global warming usually presented? I want you to take a quick look at this graph. This is very standard. This one comes from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is the way it's usually depicted. This shows you the anomaly, that's variations, from the mean of global average temperature over, I believe that graph goes from, it's too small on my laptop here to see, but at about the last 160, 170 years. And you notice, it looks like there's a whole lot of change there, doesn't it? And by the way, there's something for you to learn about the graphic presentation of data. Red is always fear-inspiring. Blue is reassuring. That's just the way we humans are. So we are psychologically set to think, oh, that cooler period was far better for us. That red period, that's dangerous. Now, I want to also call your attention to the scale of this. This is a scale of right about 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees Celsius. But the way that's drawn, it looks like huge change, doesn't it? Here are exactly the same numbers without the psychologically frightening color change, and with a simple line graph, and on a scale that reflects a fairly typical change in temperature from nighttime low to daytime high in any given location. And here, that's the same numbers, but that's on the Kelvin scale, running from absolute zero to a little bit above the highest temperatures ever recorded on Earth. You can't see any change in there. So one of the things for you to learn is to recognize that how people present numbers can be very, very deceptive, right? This is not nearly so scary as, that, right? Okay. Let's see. Now, how does that compare with temperature anomalies, to which we're all, I've left out a graph in the PowerPoint presentation. That's all right. We can skip that one. How much warming comes from adding CO2 to the atmosphere? This is what everybody's afraid of, is that CO2 emitted into the atmosphere as we burn fossil fuels to run our cars and generate electricity. That CO2 is warming the atmosphere. And by the way, basic physics tells us that's almost certainly true. CO2 is an infrared absorbing gas, meaning it absorbs heat as the heat bounces. Heat comes in from the sun, it bounces from the surface of the earth back out to space, and we have to have a pretty good balance on that, or the earth would just get warmer and warmer and warmer, and life would be impossible. Or it would get colder and colder, and life would be impossible. So we have to have a pretty decent balance to keep things in a generally livable range. Well, greenhouse gases like CO2 absorb some heat, and then they radiate that heat out from themselves back, some of it out towards space, but some of it back towards the surface of the earth, so they'll make the earth a bit warmer than it otherwise would be. And that's basic physics. And there is an evangelical climate scientist named Katharine Hayhoe who is fond of saying, look, global warming is basic physics. Well, it's also basic physics that if you drop a rock and a feather at the same moment from the same height, they'll hit the floor at the same moment. Unless you're in air, right? In which case the feather kind of goes like this. Or if it's windy, the feather might blow up into a tree and get stuck and never come down. The world is a whole lot more complicated place than basic physics. So we need to do very, very careful empirical research to answer the question, how much warming comes from adding CO2 to the atmosphere? I'm going to just be very, very brief about that and tell you that when we have finished doubling the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from pre-industrial times, from 280 parts per million to about 560 parts per million, and we'll probably reach that late this century. We will probably have, by doing so, raised global average temperature by something in the range of 1/4 degree Celsius to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, you all are familiar with temperature changes much greater than that every day. There is simply nothing dangerous about that. But there are some people who think that the increase will be more, on the order of 3 or 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, and they predict terrible outcomes from that. Well, let me tell you a few other things about this. First of all, where does the warming occur? It's not that the whole world warms the same way. According to the theory behind all of this, that the climate alarmists embrace, the warming occurs primarily toward the poles, primarily in winter, primarily at night. It doesn't occur pretty much at all toward the equator. It doesn't occur very much in the summer, even toward the poles, and it doesn't occur much at all in the daytime. In other words, cold temperatures are raised while hot temperatures remain pretty much what they were before. And that's actually a very good thing, because a warmer world is a far more livable world, not only for plants, which expand their range and grow better and produce more fruit, but also for human beings. On average, cold snaps kill 20 times as many people per day as do heat waves. We should welcome this. We expand the growing range for agriculture. We lengthen the growing year for agriculture. You have the last frost in the spring at an earlier time. You have the first frost in the fall at a later time. So the growing season increases. It's all good. And then there's, how does CO2 affect life on the earth other than just by temperature? Well, plants have to have CO2 for photosynthesis. And the more they have, the better they do. And in fact, NASA satellite sensors show us that there's been a huge change in leaf coverage in the earth over the last 50 years or so. It has been getting much more dense, and it has been spreading. And that's almost entirely because of more CO2 in the atmosphere. Wherever you see green there, that doesn't just mean it was green before. It means it is greener now than it was 50 years ago. There are a few places where you see just white, no change. And there are a few places where you see a kind of a brownish, reddish color, tiny spots, where it seems that leaf coverage is declining. But overwhelmingly around the world, we're growing more plants. Here's a way to summarize the impact of CO2 on plant growth. For every doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere, you get an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency. Plants grow better in warmer and colder temperatures and in wetter and drier soils. They make much more efficient use of water. They increase their fruit to fiber ratio, and they resist diseases and pests better. So they expand their ranges, which means that all of the different animals that depend on plants get to expand their ranges too. So if you've been hearing people tell you climate change is threatening to bring about the 6th great extinction, right? A loss of biodiversity, the truth is the exact opposite. Warming of the earth will make almost all species do far, far better than they otherwise would. And one study done by a friend of mine, Craig Idso of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change, back in 2013, I think he published this, was a study of hundreds of papers published in refereed journals over a period of about 50 years. And he was asking the question, how much added value in crop yields have we had solely because of more CO2 in the atmosphere over this period? What he concluded was, based on all those studies, CO2 added to the atmosphere had added about $3.2 trillion worth of crop yields around the world from 1960 to 2012. And if you project it out to 2050, based on our projections of how much more CO2 we will add, from 2012 to 2050, we would add another $9.8 trillion worth of crop yields just because we're putting CO2 into the air. Now, I think that fossil fuel company CEOs and other leaders should be saying to the world, look, we produce oil, we produce natural gas, we produce coal, and we use those, you use those things, you pay us for those, you use those things to generate electricity, to drive your vehicles, to make the plastics in your glasses, to make most of your medical drugs, all these different things that are a benefit to you. Thank you for paying us for those. We also put more CO2 into the atmosphere, and you don't pay us for that at all, but that CO2 is making your life much, much better. You're welcome. Instead of apologizing for their products. Their products have been the primary thing that have delivered humanity from nasty, poor, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short to long and prosperous. All right, so is climate change really a great problem? Well, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is usually looked at as kind of the world's leading authority on these things. I don't think it actually is. It's not truly a scientific body. It's an intergovernmental panel, right? All the people who work with it are appointed by their governments. Politics necessarily interferes. Nonetheless, what does the IPCC, which the climate alarmist community cites as the greatest authority, what does it say about the threat that we face from man-made global warming? First off, you will never find in its assessment reports or even in its summaries for policymakers words like crisis, danger, catastrophe, existential threat. They're not there. But second, every one of their assessment reports, which comes out about every 5 or 6 years, sometimes 7 years between them, every one of their assessment reports includes a portion where they try to forecast where the world will be economically at the end of this century based on various different scenarios about how much CO2 and other greenhouse gases we add to the atmosphere. The interesting thing is that in those forecasts, humanity is always most prosperous at the end of this century in the warmest, not the coolest scenarios. Why is that? Because those warm scenarios are driven by how much energy we use and how much of it comes from fossil fuels. But energy is the capacity to do work. That's the actual formal definition of energy in physics. Energy is the capacity to do work. Work is what we need to provide food, clothing, shelter, and everything else that we depend on for our physical lives. So the more energy we use, the more our economies grow. And indeed, in those warmer scenarios, by the end of this century, the countries that are today poorest are better off by anywhere from 30 to 70 times their current income. They're better off than the United States is today. That's amazing. And here's a key thing to understand. Poverty is a far greater threat than anything related to climate. If you have income equivalent to the bottom 10th of Americans, you can thrive in any climate from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. If you're living on the equivalent of $1 or $2 a day, you can't thrive in the best natural environment, the best tropical paradise. You can't thrive. To lift people out of poverty is far more important than to mitigate, to slow, stop, or reverse human-induced global warming. But that slowing, stopping, or reversing human-induced global warming requires using less energy, especially from fossil fuels, which means slowing economic development and trapping billions of the people in the world in the poverty that they now experience and pushing billions of other people back into poverty. So that's why I am so concerned about this. Wayne mentioned that in my early childhood, I lived in India for a while. During that time, for 6 months, my mother was paralyzed. Nobody ever understood just exactly why. My father prayed, God, please, you can take my son, just give me my wife back. And by which he meant I could die. Later on, we figured it out that God had taken his son to do a lifetime of ministry. But at the end of those 6 months, my mother just recovered, unexplained. Took her a long time to recover strength, but the paralysis stopped. But in those 6 months, every day, my nurse, or Aya, would take me by the hand early in the morning, walk me out through the courtyard of the apartment building where we lived, where I saw a beautiful green tree with a red flowering vine hanging out of it. And I still have memories of that in my mind, the pictures of that. And it was beautiful. And later, when I became a Christian and I learned to love God's creation, I've always seen that as a symbol of the beauty of God's creation. Then we left the courtyard and we went out onto the street and we walked a number of blocks to the home where I would stay for the day. And all along that walk, I was stepping over the bodies of the people who had died overnight of starvation and disease. And those pictures, too, are indelibly printed on my mind. That's a major part of what motivated me to get into all of this, because I recognize how much the environmental movement, especially the climate alarmist movement, is a threat to economic development for the people in the poorer countries of the world. One of Cornwall Alliance's network scholars is Vijay Jairaj. He's a climate scientist in India. He's Indian, and he is passionate about this because he has experienced the strangling of growth opportunities in India by Western World Bank and the Bank for International Development and so on, refusing to fund projects that it depended on fossil fuels, leaving roughly 330 million Indians today with no electricity at all, and most of the rest of the 1.4 billion Indians with only intermittent and very poor reliability electricity. So this is what motivates me on these things. So let's see. I'll skip over that. I've already said basically what it says, which is in the warmer scenarios, the poor are better off long term than in the cooler scenarios. All right. Should we fight climate change by reducing our use of fossil fuels? I'm wondering what time it is. It's 10:48. I need to stop pretty quickly, don't I? Are we supposed to end Q&A time at 11? So I will try to abbreviate this. Should we fight climate change by reducing our use of fossil fuels? Doing so would require increased government control over our economies. Otherwise, people would choose to stay with fossil fuels because they're the most abundant, affordable, and reliable of our energy sources, except for nuclear and hydro. And they're far, far better than wind and solar. And it would also require the substitution of less efficient energy sources. But two things are indispensable to lifting and keeping whole societies out of poverty. One is a set of social institutions, private property rights, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law, and entrepreneurship. Those things are essential to lifting and keeping whole societies out of poverty. But most of the environmental movement denies most of those things. And so it would slow, stop, or reverse the conquest of poverty around the world. Second, it requires abundant, affordable, reliable energy. But if we're to get off of fossil fuels, we lose most of that. Why do I say we lose most of that? Because fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas together provide about 85% of all the energy that we use in the world today. For the last 30 years, governments all around the world have been subsidizing wind and solar in an attempt to bring down our use of fossil fuels. Over those 30 years, there has been no significant change in the percentage of our energy that we get from fossil fuels. None. The world needs more and more energy, and it's going to come mostly from fossil fuels because there is no good alternative. Remember, that's after all that time of trying to force more of that. Let's see. Here we have, I put that too small in my thing here for me to read. Spread this one out a little bit. Yeah, this actually comes from a chart that's in the book that I told you about that's coming out next year. This is the average subsidy given by governments per kilowatt hour of energy, of electricity generated. Average subsidy per kilowatt hour. People in the wind and solar industry will tell you that oil and coal and natural gas get big government subsidies. Well, they're actually tiny by comparison, even just on a simple, straightforward basis. But when you compare them per kilowatt hour of energy produced, you see there that for solar gets about $350 per kilowatt hour of energy produced. Wind gets about $40-some per kilowatt, or I'm sorry, about $20-some per kilowatt hour. Geothermal gets about $14, and then all those other spots are for nuclear, hydro, and fossil fuels. Those are so little you can hardly see them on there. That's what our governments are doing. Why do we get so much energy from fossil fuels rather than from wind and solar? for some basic physics and engineering reasons having to do with energy density, power density. Don't have time to go into the technical things on that, but when you start with a very low density source of energy like wind or solar, you have to use lots of other resources to ramp that up to the high density we need for electricity and for fuel in our vehicles and things like that. So, while, yes, wind is free, sunlight is free, the cost of ramping them up to the density you need for usable energy is very high. And let's see, this compares joules, which is an energy measurement, in terms of energy density for different sources. Again, I've taken too long, don't have the time to go into detail there. This is joules per cubic meter. And you notice on this one, for oil, for oil, very, very high. For, what is the next one on there? Gasoline, very high. Coal, very high. And then you get down to natural gas. Actually, cubic meter is not a great way to measure for natural gas because as a gas, you don't have as much packed into a cubic meter. But for tidal water, wind, geothermal, and solar, they're so tiny you can't even see them on the graph. That's why that's a problem. Let's see. There's a table that compares energy sources by watts per square meter. Fossil fuels. Here's one application of this lesson to real-life question. A group at Harvard a couple of years ago set out to answer the question, how much of America's land would we have to cover with wind turbines in order to provide all of our electricity from wind? Their answer was essentially everything from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. Then they set out to answer the question, how much more land would we have to cover in order to provide in order to convert all of our vehicle fleet from gasoline and diesel to electric? And the answer was essentially all the land from the Mississippi to the Pacific. That's the difference in what you need to provide. And then there are, of course, all kinds of problems about the minerals that go into those. Many of them are toxic. They cannot be recycled economically. The waste product from spent solar panels is a serious problem. And most of the cobalt and lithium and things like that that are indispensable for electric vehicle batteries is mined either in China or in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is not democratic and not a republic. And in the Congo, it's done mostly by child labor at gunpoint. They are paid, but an extremely low amount. And in China, it's done mostly by Uyghur slaves. And we want to support that by demanding more EVs in America? I don't think so. All right. I'm going to end by giving you a message from my friend, Dr. John Christie. He's a principal research scientist in climatology at the University of Alabama, one of the two partners who manage NASA's global satellite sensing system. And he was a missionary, a teaching missionary, teaching physics in Kenya early in his career. And there he observed what life is like for those who do not have electricity. And he said, what we really need for the developing world is a change from what he calls the primitive energy system, where mostly women spend an average of 6 to 8 hours every day gathering wood and dried dung to use as their fuel for cooking and, in the cold period of the year, heating their huts. Smoke from which the World Health Organization estimates kills between 3 and 4 million people a year, most of them women and young children because they're the most exposed to it. Imagine spending 6 to 8 hours a day just getting the energy you need to cook your food and to heat your home. And it's not a 4,500 square foot or a 2,000 square foot. It's a little hovel, and that's all. you don't have much time to work to do anything else, to get anything beyond that. No wonder these people are so poor. That's the primitive energy system. It's wood and dried dung carried on the backs and the heads of women in sub-Saharan Africa or in India or in other very poor parts of the world and burned just as it is to cook and to heat. That's the primitive energy system. What those people need far more than anything about reducing climate change is a switch to the modern energy system, where electricity from nuclear and fossil fuels brings clean energy to billions of people at the cost of a few minutes of labor every day. That's what we enjoy, and that's what the rest of the world should enjoy. But if we're going to fight climate change by reducing the use of fossil fuels, the rest of the world won't enjoy it, and we will stop enjoying it. So I'll stop there and be glad to take any questions for the next 3 minutes, after which we're supposed to quit, although I'm happy to stay and ask and answer questions for as long as anybody would like. We have one right up.
I've got a mic, so I'll come up and...
Steve, can Calvin take more than 3 minutes?
Yeah, you can take more than 3 minutes.
Okay.
We're not going to cut you off.
Yeah, but what I'd like to make sure is if you need to leave, feel free. Nobody will be upset that you leave, but I will take questions for as long as necessary.
Okay.
So you said that a warmer world is a good thing, and yes, that's totally reasonable. But is there any concern or fear or issue among like your group and
Yeah.
just in general of things becoming too hot and then becoming more like a desert?
First of all, even the climate models used by the IPCC tell us that with warming, you're going to wind up with more precipitation, not less, around the world. That's because you get more evaporation as well. Now, some places will become a little bit more desertous. Other places will become much, much greener. And it looks from the models as if the greening is going to outpace the desertification, not just because warm is better for most plants than cold, but also because of the CO2. However, I should add this, the climate models cannot be refined to look at small scales. The best they can work with is an area of about 1,000 kilometers square. Okay, so we really can't answer that question terribly well, but what we can do is look back through geologic history. And the warmest periods in Earth's history have been the greenest periods, without any question. So that's that. And let me quickly piggyback on this for another fear that many people have. And that is that global warming will cause more frequent and more intense extreme weather events, hurricanes, floods, droughts, tornadoes, that sort of thing, all right? Dr. Neil Frank, who was the longest serving director of the National Hurricane Center, is one of the fellows of the Cornwall Alliance, good friend of mine, and he's still, after having served there and then as the chief meteorologist at KHOU-TV in Houston, which of course is always very concerned about hurricanes, at 90 years old, he is still doing his scientific work on hurricanes, and he explains that global warming should actually result in fewer and less powerful hurricanes rather than more and more powerful. Why? Because the climate system is essentially a heat distribution system. And if you warm primarily toward the poles, primarily in winter, primarily at night, not toward the equator in summer in the daytime, you decrease the temperature differential between poles and equator, which means there's less heat to transport from the equator toward the poles. That's what hurricanes do. So there should actually be fewer and weaker hurricanes because of global warming. That's the opposite of what most of the media tell us. It's the opposite of what the environmental movement tells us. It's the opposite of what politicians tell us. But I think it's really solid, sound science. And he's not the only hurricane specialist scientist who says that. there has in fact been zero upward trend in the frequency or the intensity of any extreme weather events. Not hurricanes, not floods, not droughts, not anything in the actual empirical measures. It's only in modeling that people come up with this notion, but the empirical evidence says no, the models are wrong. Okay, next question.
Hi, doctor. Thank you for being here. I have a question about when you said the CO2 increased yields by a lot.
Yes,
Crops.
yes.
So I was looking at this Italian study in 2015 where the GMO has an enormous impact. So how did you link the CO2 and you don't attribute it to the massive GMO that
Yeah.
is not technically there to increase? So they
Right.
say, but is it there to diminish, like losing it, right?
Yeah.
The risk of, right, so it makes it better and stronger. So from 2002 till now, they attribute 24.6% of crops yield due to the GMO.
Crop yield increase, right.
Right.
Yeah, okay, so what you have to do when you're studying this thing is to try to disentangle the contributions of the introduction of GMO and the use of better fertilizers and better farming techniques and all of that stuff from the effect of CO2. That's a difficult thing to do, but there have been hundreds of studies that have been done on that. And so what you do is, in part, you're going to look at, okay, here are fields where GMO has not been used, here are fields where they have, and here are the comparisons between the non-GMO fields today and the non-GMO fields 50 or 60 years ago. And there's still been the increased productivity in those fields, so you have to attribute it to something other than GMO because the GMO wasn't used there. Then you ask, well, was it from fertilizer? And you discover, well, no, they weren't improving their fertilizer use there. Well, was it because they had better machinery? Well, on these, they didn't. So you eliminate the potential causes in order to try to get to that one cause without which it appears that the change wouldn't have happened. And so, yeah, that's how it works. As I said, there were hundreds of studies, and if you want to, you can email me, calvin@cornwallalliance.org, and I will send you a link to the study by Craig Idso that explains this. All right?
We got one over here.
All right.
If you could please comment on the possibility or probability of oceanic floor disturbances causing massive methane releases and the effect
Yeah.
on the environment.
Okay. I think you're talking about the potential release of methane from methane hydrates on the seafloor. Okay. But we also have some concerns about the release of methane from tundra, places of that sort on land. And yes, as temperature rises, the gas that is sequestered in seawater or in tundra and so on, that gas is going to be released. Some of it is. It's Boyle's law of gases that explains how that happens. The concern is, again, one of those where you would say, yes, this is basic physics or this is basic chemistry, but the world is a lot more complex than that. Now, methane is about 300 times more efficient at infrared absorption than carbon dioxide, which is why some people are very, very worried about it. However, methane's concentration in the atmosphere is measured in parts per billion instead of parts per million. So when we look at the contribution of methane to global warming, it's actually extremely small. I almost put a slide about this into this presentation. It's one that you can find on Cornwall Alliance's website, where it compares methane's contribution to warming with CO2's contribution. CO2's contribution, remember, is about anywhere from about 1/4 of a degree to 1.5 degrees per doubling of CO2, which means, by the way, that you're going to get the same amount of warming by doubling from 280 parts per million pre-industrial revolution to 560 parts per million. When you double from there to 1120 parts per million, you have to go that much more to get the same increase, all right? Now, methane's contribution to the warming amount that goes on in the atmosphere is, if I'm remembering correctly, it's about 7% of carbon dioxide's contribution. Now, if CO2's contribution is as small as I and a bunch of climate scientists I work with think it is, then methane's at 7% of that has to be very, very small too. Okay, I think that's as much detail as I can go into.
We'll take a couple more. So there's been a huge shift away from nuclear energy. A lot of places
Sadly.
closing down,
Yeah.
based on large fears, obviously, of bad things happening. But from production, it's some of the cleanest energy.
Absolutely.
Least amount of waste. Why do you think there's so much fear around it and moving away from
Yeah.
nuclear?
That kind of a why question is really dangerous because there are levels of this. One, there are the fears of what can happen with nuclear plants. Some people think that a nuclear plant that gets out of control will explode like a nuclear weapon. That's a physical impossibility. But nonetheless, that's depicted in many movies, and people grab onto these sorts of fears. Other people think, okay, you get really dangerous radiation if you have a breach of the containment vessel. We had a breach of the containment vessel at 3 Mile Island back in whatever was the year of that. The amount of radiation, added radiation exposure that you got from that was about equivalent to if you were to move from sea level to Colorado. You get more radiation just by that change in altitude. Nobody's worried about it. Nobody got sick from 3 Mile Island. How many people, by the way, died of radiation from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster? 40. Yeah, I think the best number is 32, actually. I got that from, now I can't remember his name, Polish man who was the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who led the study of the effects of Chernobyl. Those people died of radiation exposure right there on site because they were involved in trying to put out the fires at Chernobyl, which, by the way, was from a plant that was using a technology that would never have been approved in the West, and where the operators were drunk and had been playing chicken day after day, seeing how close they could come to running the thing out of control without it's actually getting there. This is craziness. Nevertheless, nuclear has the best safety record of any energy source that we have. So whereas I will defend fossil fuels very much, I'll defend nuclear even more. And I think that nuclear is going to be the source for the vast majority, at least of electricity, that we use starting about maybe 50 years from now. But that's a totally different subject. Ma'am.
Thank you for coming. I do have a question. What are your thoughts on water? So we all live in Arizona.
Uh-huh.
You know how we all think about the desert in Arizona.
Right.
But, you know, I talk to people all over the United States, and they're all saying their lakes are drying up. Look at Lake Mead.
Yes.
And so, you know, but with everyone saying, oh, you've got to cut back on water, we're going to run out of water. But, you know,
Okay.
continuing to build everywhere, and
Yeah.
it seems to
Yeah.
be mindful of that.
Yeah. I mean, water, of course, through the hydrological cycle, right, renews, but it renews only at a certain rate. And we can exceed that rate in our consumption of water, and that can cause problems. The price system is, I think, the best solution to that sort of thing. Price needs to reflect the ratio of supply to demand, and it should rise and fall as that ratio changes. Unfortunately, most of our water policy around the United States divorces price completely from that ratio. And so people use a whole lot of water because it's so cheap. If it were more expensive, we would use less. That's a political issue, and it should be solved politically. Now, are we seeing some huge reduction in rainfall in this area due to human-induced global warming? The answer to that is no. We're seeing it due to natural cycles driven by ocean currents primarily, and in part by cycles in solar energy output and solar magnetic wind output, which affects cloud formation, which in turn affects temperature and precipitation and so on. But it's primarily the ocean currents, especially what's called the El Nino Southern Oscillation, El Nino and La Nina. And La Nina always dries and heats the southwest United States. El Nino cools and wets the southwest United States. We are now in the third straight year of La Nina. That's only happened once before in the last 50 years, but we do know from geological evidence that it's not, an unusual occurrence. It happens from time to time. But that's the primary cause of the reduced precipitation that we've seen in the American desert Southwest over the last about 7 years. We also had a double La Nina about 6 years ago, 2015 through early 2017. So those are the primary causes of that. The cycles will go the other way. It's a matter of patience. But meanwhile, we need to be careful with how we use resources like that, okay? And the price mechanism is probably the best way to determine. Another question?
Yes, when you give this presentation to believers in climate change.
I wish I could.
Well, you don't do that
I would be glad to. They won't come. For over a decade, the Cornwall Alliance has had a standing challenge to the Evangelical Environmental Network, which is the most outspoken group of evangelicals on the climate alarmist side. Our challenge has been this: you choose a climate scientist, an economist, and a theologian of your choice to defend your point of view on this. And we'll bring a climate scientist, an economist, and a theologian of our choice, and we will debate you formally at any Christian college that's willing to host this, and we will cover the costs. Basically, that's meant I've had to be willing to cover the costs out of my own pocket because Cornwall Alliance doesn't have that budget. But I'm serious. I would do this. For over 10 years, we've had this challenge out to them, and they won't even respond.
Do they look at the data that you present and just merely interpret it to fit their agenda, or do they generate their own to fit their agenda? It seems like many countries in the world and many large corporations all have a lot of money invested in plans to combat climate change.
Yes, they do.
How do we change that? Because it seems like the other side is being listened to far more than what our data says.
Yeah. There was a fascinating comment made recently by a member of the UN IPCC. Just in about the past week, Michael Schellenberger writes about this in something that I'm about to quote in one of the pieces on our blog. And she said that we have worked with Google to downgrade references to anything that questions the IPCC position on climate change. She says, we own the science on this. So yeah, communicating about this is very, very difficult. Now, what do people like the EEN and others do with the data? Well, I think many of them just simply don't look at the data. I know the president of the EEN, Mitch Hescox, and He has written stuff that is just flat out, factually, demonstrably false. And he's written it about us. He's written it about, I'm sorry. That's as far as I should go about that. There are ways to try to interpret data differently, but the biggest problem is that so many people depend on computer climate models instead of on real-world observations. They treat the model output as if it were evidence. No, model output is not evidence. Model output is predictions based on hypothesis. And in the scientific method, you have a guess, a hypothesis as to how something in the world works. On the basis of that hypothesis, you make some predictions about what you should see in the world. And then you compare what you really see with those predictions. And as the late Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman puts it, if the observations contradict the predictions, your theory is wrong. That's all there is to it. It doesn't matter how smart you are, how beautiful your theory is, how many people agree with you. If the observations contradict the predictions, your theory is wrong. Well, the observations contradict the models consistently. On average, up until the 5th generation of these models, they overestimated or they over-scenarioed the warming of the past 30 to 50 years by anywhere from 2 to 3 times. The 6th generation, you would think that they'd be getting better over time. We're spending billions of dollars on them, right? But the 6th generation instead over-forecasts warming or hindcasts it. Instead of by 2 to 3 times, now it's by 2 to 4 times, and some of them 5 times. But people look at the models instead of the real-world evidence.
We have quite a few people that still want to ask questions, but I want to give freedom to those of you that feel like you want to go. Feel free to get up.
Yep.
Don't feel badly about it, because I know a lot of this is important to some of you, and we'll get around to you. But
Yeah.
we have a list of about 5 or 6 more people that want to ask questions.
And I would remind you of the literature table out there. Anything you want is free. There is a suggested donation price if you want to do something like that. That would be helpful. All right? Question?
So most of us are not policymakers. We
Right.
can't shape policies ourselves. So as believers in Christ, what can we do?
Oh, thank you.
That you talked about these problems that you mentioned. Are there any practical takeaways?
Yes.
That you would want us to hear about?
Thank you so much for that question. How much do I owe you for that? Yeah, that's actually part of my outline and I didn't get to it. Number one, tell your elected representatives or people who are running for office that you do not want them supporting wind, solar, and other renewable energy sources as alternatives to fossil fuels. And tell them you want simply a level playing field. No subsidies to any energy sources. All subsidies, all tax incentives, gone. And just let the market determine which energy sources provide most of our energy. Tell your elected representatives that. Urge them to get off the global warming alarmist bandwagon. Tell them to study, send them to our website or to a website called the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. This is run by a number of friends of mine, again, top-class scientists. Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change issues reports similar to those that come out from the IPCC, but there are no politicians involved in this. These are all just plain scientists. Most of them are tenured or retired, so they don't have to fear what happens to their careers when they speak out on this. And those reports are loaded with good data to back this kind of a position. What else can you do? Well, for one thing, you can learn more. You can subscribe to our email newsletter, cornwallalliance.org. Scroll to the bottom of the page, and you'll see a spot to do that. You can also listen to our Created to Reign podcast. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, various other platforms. And you can take some of the literature or DVDs from our resource table as well. And I would really encourage you, share these things with your kids, your grandkids. Our educational system is overwhelmed with this stuff. The mainstream media are overwhelmed with this stuff. And the younger people are getting basically one message. It's a really tough thing to counter that, but you have some potential to have an impact there. The particular documentary DVD that we have out there called Blue, and we may have run out of copies of it already because we didn't have a lot with us, but you can order it from our website on our online store. That is a great communicator with young people. It was actually made by a 24-year-old homeschooled guy from Montana. It's brilliant. He traveled the world to talk with some of the world's leading scientists. And it's beautiful, it's highly motivating, and very, very good science. So,
Speaking of young people, I have a young person with a question.
All right.
What is the effect of global warming on the ice caps?
On the ice caps. Okay, as temperature rises above freezing, ice melts. As it descends below freezing, ice, water solidifies, okay? So, of course, some warming up there is going to reduce ice packs. Now, again, that's basic physics, right? But again, the world is a far more complicated place than basic physics. What we see is that there is an oscillation, and this is clearly shown in geological records stretching back, through all of Earth's history. There's an interesting oscillation. When the North Pole is getting colder, the South Pole is getting warmer. When the South Pole is getting colder, the North Pole is getting warmer. There's some interesting theories about why that happens, all right? Now, the first thing to point out is that when sea ice melts, many people are worried about sea level rise. There has been, by the way, no increase in the rate of sea level rise during the period of so-called human-induced global warming. It's been rising at an average of about 1.5 to 2 millimeters per year. That comes out to about 7 or 8 to 10 millimeters per century. Inches per century. And that is not a rate that we have any difficulty adapting to. We can build seawalls. The Dutch have handled this for hundreds of years. Okay, so when sea ice melts, it makes no difference in sea level. Just as when the ice cubes in your glass melt, it doesn't raise the level of the water. When land ice melts, it contributes to a rise in sea level. But even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, when it tries to forecast the amount of sea level rise that you're going to get from the melting of land-based ice fields, and the two biggest places, of course, are Antarctica and Greenland, right? I ran their numbers for my home in South Florida when I lived there. I lived 15 miles from the beach. I was 8 feet above sea level. And running their numbers, I would have beachfront property in approximately 3,600 years. Now, we know that the Earth has warmed and cooled cyclically throughout geologic history. 3,600 years is a long time, and we will have a lot of cycles of warming and cooling during that period. Furthermore, we are undoubtedly going to change our energy technologies somehow over the next 3,600 years. I can't tell you how, but nobody could have told you in the year 1900 that France would get 70% of its, 80% I think it is, of its electricity from nuclear energy by the 1970s. But it did. So we're going to make changes, right? I am simply not concerned about what's happening with the ice. And we have a number of articles about this on our blog. Just look up Greenland and restrict your Google search to site:cornwallalliance.org, and you'll see some good articles on that.
Okay, we're gonna take one last overall question, but Calvin will still
Yeah.
how quick that has just descended.
It is. What we should do is we should totally ignore it. I mean, we just go ahead and say what we want to say. We testify, we speak of God, we speak of Christ, we speak the gospel. And if that means we get thrown to the lions, more power to us. I mean, that's great. Paul said, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Bring it on, right? No, we should be courageous. We should be joyful. We should be very forthright in speaking the truth to these things. I have 2 books to recommend to you about this, neither of which do we carry, though for a while we gave one away as a gift to donors, but we've run out. These 2 books are Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher, and he explains how survivors of the communist domination of Eastern European countries over and over have explained to him it wasn't by force that communism took over our countries. It was by our self-silencing in the face of political correctness. We have to say, I am going to speak the truth, and I am not going to use people's preferred pronouns or any other such thing that is based in falsehood. We're going to speak the truth. The second book is by my friend Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi. He's an Indian Christian philosopher. It's called The Book That Made Your World. And in it, he explains how the Bible, through the influence of Christianity, shaped Western civilization to give us such things as private property rights, the rule of law, the impartial treatment of people in courts of law, all sorts of things that we take for granted, like fish in water, right? That came only because of the Bible. And our society is turning its back on that, and because of that, we're in serious danger of losing these things. It's a brilliant book, and by the way, if you've ever heard any of or seen any of the videos by Jordan Peterson did a wonderful interview of Vishal Mangalwadi about that book. It's a great way to learn about it. Those 2 things will help equip us, to confront our increasingly secularizing and our increasingly hostile culture. But we just have to be happy to say, great. To me, it's a privilege to be persecuted for righteousness' sake. Right?
Cal, thank you very much. If you'll hang this up here for a few minutes. If you have any other questions, feel free to come up. God bless you guys. Thanks for being here today. And drive safe. And enjoy that $5 a gallon gas.
And my thanks to all of you for coming. Really appreciate it.